How does a $400 Canon M50 stack up against a $4,000 Sony FX3? We're gonna be taking a side-by-side look at the footage to see how it compares and if it's really worth 10 times the price. So you might already be thinking, how can you possibly compare these two cameras? Like, they don't even relate. The Canon M50 is 8 bits and it does 4K up to 30 frames per second, and it's a crop sensor and that's it. Whereas on the Sony FX3, you have full frame sensor that does 16-bit ProRes RAW outputs, and it can do up to 120 frames per second in 4K. Like, they're just not apples to apples. This is not gonna be a full spec versus spec comparison, but all of that doesn't really matter when you look at the final image. Now let's take a look at the side-by-side footage right now and leave a comment below, which one do you think is the A camera and which one do you think is the B camera? So we were out yesterday filming test footage, but it was a very overcast day. And for those of you that know what good lighting looks like, you know that overcast days can actually be really great advantage for you because it makes it look like your camera has better dynamic range than it actually does. So I'm out here filming some additional test footage when it's actually a sunny day, so you can really see the difference in dynamic range. How obvious was it which camera was the Sony camera and which one was the Canon camera? Did it take you a couple shots to figure it out, or did you just know right away? So if you didn't already figure it out, the A camera was the Canon M50 and the B camera was the Sony FX3. Now, when we were out shooting, I tried to match the exposure settings of these cameras as closely as possible, but it was a little bit difficult to do because they obviously have pretty big differences in dynamic range. Canon claims that the M50 has 13.6 stops of dynamic range, which honestly, I think is a pretty big stretch. I don't really think it's quite there. Now for Sony, they claim that the FX3 has 15 plus stops of dynamic range, which in all honesty, I think it's very close to that. Dynamic range between these two cameras is probably one of the most noticeable differences. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what dynamic range is, I'm gonna make this as simple as possible. Basically, it means what the sensor is actually capable of capturing in terms of information in the brightest highlights and the deepest shadows. I tried to expose the images as closely as possible. On the Canon M50, I was using the Tokina Cinema 11 to 20 millimeter lens, and that was opened up to t2.9 the entire time. And on the Sony FX3, I was using the Rokinon 24 millimeters, and I had it opened up to t2.8. And in order to balance the exposure, I was using ND filters on both of the lenses. Now, back to our favorite topic of dynamic range. It was really interesting to see how the Canon M50 really held its own against the Sony FX3 as long as the lighting was pretty even and there wasn't huge differences between the highlights and shadows. So maybe you live in a place that's overcast all the time like London or Seattle, dynamic range really won't be much of a problem for you. But for me, I live in Arizona and most of the time it is bright blue, super sunny, and very hot outside. And that is a big challenge for most cameras. So that's why with these shots, you could see where things are in shade. If you want to expose properly for the sky, you really are gonna end up crushing all that foreground and the shadows are going to become very dark. You're going to lose all of that detail. Whereas if you want to, of course, expose for your subject and the foreground, you start to really blow out that sky. You see everything going much more white. You lose all that color and detail in the clouds. Now, in contrast, when looking at the Sony FX3 footage, you don't have to make those sacrifices and just expose for either the sky or the subject and foreground. You can really get both of them balanced nicely and still see great detail. This is why dynamic range is so important. I think it just goes over a lot of people's heads. For you, this may not be a problem depending on what you're shooting. For instance, if you use the Canon M50 a lot indoors and you do a lot of studio shooting and you can actually control the lighting like I'm doing here, dynamic range really starts to take a back seat. It doesn't matter that much. I mean, you could probably shoot the entire thing on an iPhone and it's gonna look pretty good because you could actually control all of the lighting. But if you shoot a lot of things outdoors, run and gun, maybe wedding films, those sort of things, having a camera like the FX3, A7S III, or FX6 is gonna be a huge advantage to you. You don't have to make those trade-offs in deciding what you're gonna expose for and try to keep the information in, especially if you're shooting an S-Log2 or S-Log3. Having the ability to shoot in a flat picture profile is huge, whereas on the Canon M50, there aren't any flat picture profiles, so the color profile is much more baked into it. Right out of the box, honestly, the colors look really good, and I think that's really well known in the camera industry. Canon does a great job at their color science. And my first DSLR was a Canon Rebel T3i, and the colors looked really good, but I always struggled to get that creative color grade that I wanted because it was just so baked in. When I was actually editing in post-production, I couldn't really adjust it and customize the colors as much as I wanted to. I felt kind of stuck in the way that the camera had designed the look for me. Now, it's funny because I ended up trying to match the FX3 footage to the M50 as much as I could, and I had to actually decide, how much do I want to crush the shadows on the FX3 footage because I'm just gonna lose detail, but I wanted them to actually look pretty similar. But just know that with the way that I color graded it, there was actually just a ton of detail and information in both the shadows and highlights that I could play with. Whereas on the Canon M50, how you actually expose it when you're out shooting is really how it's gonna be. Take all that with a grain of salt because you might not want to actually spend time in post-production color grading your flat images, and it might just be too much of a headache and time consuming for you and what you actually need. You might just want a great looking image with great color science directly out of the camera. That's not to say that you can't get a great image directly out of the Sony FX3, because you can. Depending on which picture profile you're shooting in, you're gonna get a lot more contrast in color if you're not shooting in S-Log. Both of these cameras shoot in 4K. Now the M50, it only costs $400. The FX3 costs $4,000. So why would you pay that difference when you're getting the same resolution? It's just 3840 by 2160, right? Well, not all 4K and not all resolution is equal. Now, I can tell you that comparing this 4K footage side by side, the Canon M50 footage looks a lot softer. Whereas on the FX3, you're seeing so much more detail and resolution maintained in all parts of the image. It just looks much sharper, but that also gives it a more digital look. Whereas on the M50, I was actually kind of pleasantly surprised. It looked more filmic right out of the camera. Another thing I want to touch on just a little bit is that it's a little bit unfair comparing a full frame sensor versus a crop sensor when it comes to shallow depth of field, because on the full frame, of course, you're gonna get a much more shallow depth of field and creamy bokeh much easier than you can get on a crop sensor. Because to get a similar look on the crop sensor, you need to shoot with a lens like f1.8 to get that really nice shallow depth of field. It's also worth mentioning that crop sensor glass is typically much cheaper than full frame glass. Honestly, I was really impressed with the Canon M50. There were times when I was lining up the shots and thinking, man, these both look pretty good. But of course, there were those times when the FX3 had a huge advantage, and that really showed in those high contrast scenarios. Ultimately, it depends on what kind of things you're shooting and what capabilities you need from your camera. But remember, it's not the camera that makes a great video, it's the person behind it. All right, guys, if you want to see more videos like this, hit subscribe right now, and I'll see you in the next video.